When a music legend with decades of experience sits down with a talk show host known for his provocative questions, sparks can fly. And that's exactly what happened when Dionne Warwick joined Andy Cohen for what was supposed to be a routine late-night interview. The evening began smoothly enough, under the blazing studio lights. Warwick walked onto the set with the kind of effortless grace that comes only from 6 decades in the spotlight. Dressed in an elegant cream-colored suit, her short hair perfectly styled, she exuded the confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. Andy greeted her warmly, beaming as he extended his hand. "Miss Warwick, it's such an honor to have you here," he said enthusiastically as the audience applauded. Dionne smiled politely and replied with composed professionalism, "Thank you for having me." Once the audience settled, Andy began with a light-hearted question about her timeless beauty. "You look absolutely incredible," he said. "What's the secret?" Without hesitation, Dionne replied, "Good genes and minding my business," earning laughter from the crowd. But her tone carried a subtle edge, a sign she wasn't in the mood for fluff. Andy pressed on, pivoting to her Twitter fame. "Your account is legendary," he remarked. "Do you actually write all those tweets yourself?" Dionne's eyes narrowed slightly. "Of course, I write them myself. Who else would write them?" Andy, caught off guard, tried to clarify that many celebrities have social media teams. "Your tweets are just so sharp," he said. "I say what I mean," Dionne responded coolly. "Is that a problem?" The tension thickened as the audience sensed the shift in energy. Trying to recover. Andy complimented her honesty and brought up one of her viral tweets about someone mispronouncing her name. "People should know how to pronounce someone's name before they speak about them," Dionne replied firmly. "It's called respect, something that seems to be in short supply these days." Andy nodded quickly, attempting to steer the conversation toward her storied career. "You've worked with so many greats, Burt Bacharach, Hal David, but there were also some complicated relationships. Can you talk about the challenges you faced as a woman in the industry back then?" Dionne's voice cooled even more. "Back then," she repeated. "You say that as if those challenges don't exist now." Andy fumbled slightly, insisting that things had improved. "Have they?" she countered. "Because from where I'm sitting, people are still asking the same tired questions. Still trying to get artists to talk about drama instead of their craft. Still reducing women to their relationships with men instead of celebrating what they've accomplished." The studio fell silent. Andy's smile faltered before he regained composure. "That's not what I'm trying to do, Miss Warwick. I'm genuinely interested in your story." "My story," she repeated, "is that I recorded some of the most iconic songs in American music history. I've won multiple Grammys, sold over 100 million records worldwide, served as a United Nations ambassador, and raised money for AIDS research when people were afraid to even talk about it. But you want to ask me about complicated relationships?" Andy shifted uncomfortably, realizing he had misjudged his guest. He tried to broaden the scope, saying the audience was interested in all aspects of her life. "Then ask me about my humanitarian work," Dionne interjected sharply. "Ask me about using my platform to help people during the AIDS crisis when so many others stayed silent. Ask me about the schools I've helped fund, the children I've mentored. There's plenty to discuss that doesn't involve gossip." The tension in the studio was now unmistakable. Andy glanced off camera, perhaps seeking guidance from his producers, before turning back with a strained smile. "You're absolutely right, and we'll get to all of that," he said carefully. "But people also connect with artists on a personal level." "Personal is not the same as private," Dionne cut in. "And I've always been very clear about where that line is." Andy paused, clearly working to regain control of the conversation. "Okay, fair enough," he said finally, shifting back to safer ground. "Let's talk about your music. You're known for these incredible ballads, these love songs that have stood the test of time. The momentary truce hung in the air. But everyone in the room, including the audience, knew they had just witnessed one of the most charged and unforgettable exchanges in late-night television history. Asterisk, walk on by. I say a little prayer. Do you know the way to San Jose? Andy Cohen's voice softened as he leaned in. What was it about Burt Bacharach's compositions that resonated so deeply with you? For the first time since she'd sat down, Dionne Warwick's posture relaxed, and a flicker of warmth appeared in her expression. Burt understood melody in a way very few composers do, she said thoughtfully. His chord progressions weren't standard. They were sophisticated, complex. They required a vocalist who could navigate those changes with precision. And Hal David's lyrics complemented Burt's music perfectly. Together, they created emotional landscapes. When I sang their songs, I wasn't just performing. I was inhabiting entire stories. Asterisk, that's beautiful, Andy said, sounding genuinely moved. And when you were recording those songs, did you ever imagine they'd become as timeless as they are now? Dionne shook her head slightly. I knew they were special, she admitted. But timeless. That's for the listeners to decide, not the artist. What I knew was that I was being given material that allowed me to showcase my instrument in ways most songs didn't. Burt wrote specifically for my voice. And that kind of collaboration is rare. Andy sensed a moment of connection and leaned forward. And when that collaboration ended, when you and Burt stopped working together, was that difficult for you personally? Asterisk, the warmth disappeared instantly from Dionne's face. We're back to this, she said flatly. Andy raised his hands defensively. I'm just asking about a significant professional relationship. Dionne's tone sharpened. No, you're asking in a way that's fishing for drama. Burt and I had a remarkable run together. When it ended, we both moved on to other projects. That's how careers work. Not everything needs to be framed as a tragedy or a scandal. Andy hesitated, flipping through his notes. But there were reports, Dionne cut in, her voice slicing through his words. Written by people who weren't in the room, who didn't know what they were talking about, who were more interested in selling papers than telling the truth. I don't deal in reports. I deal in facts. Asterisk, Andy's face flushed. I'm not trying to upset you, Miss Warwick. Then stop asking questions designed to do exactly that, she replied calmly. The audience was silent, hanging on every word as the tension grew thicker. Andy glanced down at his notes again, clearly searching for a lifeline. Let's talk about your recent projects, he said, his voice a touch unsteady. You've been in the studio again, working on new material. What can you tell us about that? Dionne studied him for a long moment before answering. I'm always working on new material, she said finally. Music doesn't stop just because you reach a certain age, despite what this industry seems to believe. Asterisk, no one's suggesting that, Andy said quickly. Dionne tilted her head. Aren't they? When was the last time you had someone over 70 on this show talking about their new music? Not reminiscing about the old days, not doing nostalgia tours, but discussing current creative work. Andy opened his mouth to respond, then shut it again, unable to find an answer. Exactly, Dionne said softly. The industry wants to put people like me in a box labeled legend and leave us there like museum pieces, instead of living, breathing artists who still have something to say. Asterisk, Andy cleared his throat, visibly working to recover. I think that's a really important point you're making, he said, and I want to give you the platform to talk about your new work. So, tell us what's inspiring you musically right now. Dionne leaned back in her chair, her shoulders squared, her gaze steady. The fire in her eyes made it clear that whatever came next, she wasn't done making her mark on this interview or on music itself. I'm inspired by the same things that have always inspired me, Dionne Warwick said, her voice calm but certain. Love, loss, hope, resilience. The human experience doesn't change just because decades pass. What changes is how we express it, the production styles, the technology we use to capture it. But the core emotions, those are timeless. Andy Cohen nodded appreciatively. That's profound, he said. Are you working with any contemporary producers or artists on this new material? Dionne smiled faintly. I am. There are some incredibly talented people making music today who understand the importance of melody and lyrical substance. Not everything has to be about beats and hooks. Sometimes a song needs to breathe, needs space to let the emotion come through. Andy's face brightened, clearly relieved to have found neutral ground again. Speaking of contemporary artists, he continued, there's been this whole conversation online about your tweets regarding some of the newer singers. People found it hilarious when you asked if they knew the difference between a melody and a hook. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Dionne's jaw tightened ever so slightly. I wasn't trying to be hilarious, she said evenly. I was asking a legitimate question. Andy, sensing an opportunity, pressed on. But it came across as pretty critical of today's artists, he said, leaning forward with that glint in his eye. Dionne's tone dropped to a dangerous quiet. Critical or honest? There's a difference, Andy. When I came up in this business, you had to be able to sing. Actually sing. Not rely on studio tricks and auto-tune or producers who could make anyone sound passable. You had to have an instrument or real voice that could carry a melody. Hold a note, convey emotion through your performance alone. Andy leaned in, not backing down. But don't you think music evolves? Every generation has its own sound, its own style. Just because it's different doesn't mean it's less valid. Dionne met his gaze, head on. I didn't say different was less valid, she said. I said basic musicianship seems to be optional new, and that's a problem. You can evolve without abandoning fundamentals. You can innovate without throwing away everything that made music great in the first place. Andy crossed his arms slightly. But who decides what makes music great? Isn't that subjective? Quality is not as subjective as people like to pretend it is, Dionne countered. There are objective measures: vocal ability, musicianship, songwriting craft. You can prefer different styles, sure. But let's not act like everything is equal just because it's popular. A ripple moved through the audience. Some nodded in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably. Andy glanced at his producers off camera, and Dionne caught the look instantly. Are we boring you? She asked sharply. What? No, not at all, Andy stammered. I'm just, we're running up against a commercial break. Then take your commercial break, Dionne said coolly. I'll be here. Andy forced a smile and turned to the camera. We'll be right back with more from the legendary Dionne Warwick. Don't go anywhere. As the lights dimmed for the break, Andy loosened his collar and took a sip of water. Dionne sat perfectly still, her posture regal, her expression unreadable. A producer rushed over, whispering something to Andy, who nodded and looked over at his guest. Miss Warwick, I hope you know I have nothing but respect for you and your work, he said, his tone softer now, more genuine without the cameras rolling. Then show it, Dionne replied, not raising her voice, not moving an inch. Show it by asking me questions that reflect that respect. Before Andy could respond, the stage manager called out that they were back in 30 seconds. Andy straightened his jacket, plastered on his trademark grin, and faced the camera once more. Dionne didn't move, a portrait of composure and controlled fire. And we're back with the incomparable Dionne Warwick, Andy announced, his voice upbeat. Before the break, we were having a really interesting discussion about music, evolution, and standards. You mentioned that basic musicianship seems optional now. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that? Dionne studied him, gauging whether this was a sincere question or another trap. What I mean, she said carefully, is that the bar has been lowered. In my day, if you couldn't sing, you didn't get a record deal. Period. You might be beautiful, you might have a great image, but if you couldn't deliver vocally, none of that mattered. Now, image comes first, and the singing is almost an afterthought. Asterisk, but couldn't someone argue that you're gatekeeping? Andy asked, that edge returning to his tone. That you're essentially saying only people who fit a traditional mold deserve to make music. Dionne's eyes flashed. Gatekeeping. Let me tell you something about gates. Andy, gates exist to keep standards in place, to ensure quality, to protect the integrity of a craft. I'm not saying people shouldn't make music. Anyone can make music. But when you ask me to celebrate mediocrity as if it's excellence, when you tell me I should accept that auto-tuned mumbling is equivalent to what Aretha Franklin did, what Whitney Houston did, what I've spent my entire life doing, then yes, I'm going to stand at that gate. Asterisk. Andy hesitated. Whitney Houston, he repeated. You were close with Whitney, weren't you? You're actually related cousins, I believe. Dionne's entire body went still. Don't, she said. Andy pressed lightly. I'm just saying, you mentioned her name, and I think a lot of people would love to hear. I said, don't, Dionne repeated, her voice like steel. Don't you dare use her name as a segue into whatever tabloid conversation you're trying to manufacture. Andy held up his hands. I'm not trying to manufacture anything, he said quickly. You brought her up as an example of vocal excellence, and I agree with you. She was incredible. I was just Andy began, but Dionne cut him off sharply. You were just looking for an opening to ask me about her struggles. Her personal life, her death, she finished for him. Her words clipped and precise. That's what you people always do. You can't just let greatness stand on its own. You have to pick at the wounds. Excavate the pain. Turn tragedy into entertainment. Andy's voice rose defensively. That's not fair. I interview people about all aspects of their lives. That's what this show is. Asterisk, it doesn't make me uncomfortable, Dionne said, her voice dropping to that dangerous quiet again. It makes me disappointed because you have an opportunity here to have a real conversation about music. About artistry, about the state of the industry, and instead, you keep trying to steer us toward gossip and drama. Is that really all you have to offer? The studio had gone completely silent. Andy's face flushed red, his jaw tightening. You know what? I think I've been pretty respectful considering asterisk. Considering what? Dionne interrupted. Considering I'm not playing along. Considering I'm not giving you the sound bites you wanted. This is my show, Andy snapped, his voice tight. I decide what we talk about. And I decide what I answer, Dionne countered calmly. That's how interviews work when both parties are equals. But maybe that's the problem. Maybe you're not used to interviewing people who see themselves as your equal. Andy's mouth fell open slightly. I cannot believe you just said that. Why? Because it's true, Dionne asked. You talk down to your guests. You ask invasive questions disguised as curiosity. You fish for drama because that's what gets clicks. But some of us remember when interviews were about substance. Asterisk. Andy abruptly stood from behind his desk, a move that clearly startled everyone. You know what, Miss Warwick? I invited you here to have a conversation, and you've done nothing but attack me and my show since you sat down. Dionne remained seated, completely calm. I accepted your invitation because I thought it would be an opportunity to discuss my work. Instead, you've spent this entire time trying to bait me into fights and dredge up painful memories. I have been nothing but gracious to you, Andy said, his voice growing louder. I praised your work. I called you a legend. Words are empty without actions to back them up, Dionne replied, finally standing. You can call me a legend all you want, but if you treat me like a circus act, the title means nothing. Asterisk, the two of them stood there facing each other across the desk. The tension so thick it was almost tangible. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing television history or a complete disaster. Andy took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. "Miss Warwick, I think maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we start over? Let's talk about something positive. Your career spans 6 decades. What moment stands out as the proudest of your life?" Dionne studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You think you can just reset the conversation? Pretend the last 20 minutes didn't happen?" "I'm trying to salvage this interview," Andy said through gritted teeth. "I'm trying to give you an opportunity to share something meaningful with the audience." Asterisk salvage, Dionne repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "As if this interview is a sinking ship. Let me tell you something, Andy. This interview was doomed the moment you decided to prioritize sensationalism over substance." Andy's face darkened to nearly crimson. "You have been combative and hostile since the moment you sat down. I have tried repeatedly to steer this into productive territory, and you fought me at every turn. Productive for whom?" Dionne shot back. "Productive for your ratings. Productive for your viral clips. Because it certainly hasn't been productive for me having to defend my integrity and my career against your thinly veiled attempts to create controversy." "That is not what I'm doing," Andy insisted, his voice rising. "I ask tough questions. That's my job. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews." The audience gasped audibly. Dionne's eyes went cold, her expression hardening. "If I can't handle it, let me tell you what I can handle, Andy. I can handle 6 decades in an industry that tried to tear me down at every turn. I can handle racism, sexism, ageism, and every other ism you can think of. What I cannot and will not handle is disrespect disguised as journalism." Asterisk, the fact that you don't like my questions doesn't make them disrespectful, Andy said, shaking his head. "You brought up Whitney's name to exploit her memory for drama," Dionne said, her voice trembling slightly now with barely contained anger. "You've repeatedly tried to reduce my accomplishments to relationship gossip. You've questioned whether I'm relevant, and you call that respect?" Andy threw his hands up in exasperation as the tension in the studio reached its breaking point. "I'm trying to have a real conversation with you," Andy insisted, his voice taut with frustration. "Real conversations include difficult topics. That's what makes for compelling television." "Compelling television," Dionne repeated slowly, nodding as if the words themselves confirmed everything she'd suspected. "There it is. That's what this is really about. Not honoring my legacy, not exploring my artistry. It's about creating a moment, a clip, something that will trend tomorrow." "That's part of the business," Andy said defensively. "You've been in this business long enough to understand how it works." "I understand perfectly how it works," Dionne replied coolly. "What I don't understand is why you think I should participate in my own diminishment. Why you think I should smile and nod while you try to turn me into a caricature." Asterisk, the studio was so silent now that the faint hum of the cameras was audible. From offstage, Andy's producer gestured urgently for him to calm things down, but Andy seemed to have reached his limit. "You know what, Miss Warwick?" he snapped. "I think you came here looking for a fight. I think you wanted to make me the villain so you could play the victim. Well, congratulations. You've gotten your moment." Dionne's eyebrows lifted, a humorless smile tugging at her lips. "My moment," she repeated. "This isn't about moments or clips or viral videos. This is about principle. It's about drawing a line and saying, it's far and no further. Your legacy is secure," Andy said, his tone softening slightly. "No one is trying to diminish what you've accomplished. Then why not celebrate it?" Dionne countered. "Why not ask me about the craft? Why not explore how I've maintained my artistry across decades? There are so many substantive questions you could have asked, but you chose not to. Andy hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. I did ask you about your craft, he said weakly. I asked about Burt Bacharach, about your new music. You asked surface-level questions designed to lead into personal drama. Dionne interrupted. Every question was a setup. Tell me, Andy, what have you learned about my artistry in the last 30 minutes? What insight have you gained into my creative process? Andy opened his mouth but said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and damning. That's what I thought, Dionne said quietly. You haven't learned anything because you weren't trying to learn. You were trying to provoke. She reached up, unclipping the microphone from her lapel with deliberate calm. The gesture was final. The audience gasped, realizing what was happening. Wait, what are you doing? Andy asked, alarm creeping into his voice. I'm leaving, Dionne said simply, placing the mic gently on the arm of the chair. I came here in good faith. That was clearly a mistake. You can't just leave in the middle of an interview, Andy protested, his professional veneer cracking. We're live. We're on air. I can do whatever I choose to do, Dionne corrected, her tone firm but composed. And I choose not to participate in this anymore. Andy looked frantically toward his producers, then back at Dionne. Miss Warwick, please, he pleaded. Can we just talk about this? Off camera. We can figure this out. There's nothing to figure out, Dionne replied, already moving toward the edge of the stage. You wanted a moment, Andy? You got one, just not the one you were hoping for. Andy's voice softened, taking on an almost desperate edge. This is not how I wanted this to go. I truly admire your work. I wanted to have a conversation about your incredible career. Dionne paused at the steps and turned back toward him. Then you should have acted like it. Admiration without respect is worthless. You can admire someone's work while still treating them poorly on. That's exactly what you did here tonight. Please don't do this, Andy said. Stay. We'll change direction. We'll talk about whatever you want. It's too late for that, Dionne replied firmly. You've shown me who you are as an interviewer, and I believe you. I'm not going to give you the opportunity to do more damage. Andy made one final attempt. The viewers, the people watching at home, they tune in to see legends like you. Don't you owe them? Dionne's expression hardened instantly. Don't you dare try to use the audience as leverage. I owe the audience my best work, my authentic self, my truth. And my truth right now is that I will not compromise my dignity for anyone's entertainment. With that, she descended the steps, her posture regal, her head held high. Andy stood frozen behind his desk, helpless. Realizing there was nothing he could say to undo what had just happened. This is unbelievable, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Dionne paused one last time and turned back toward him. Looking back, what's unbelievable, Andy? Is that you had the opportunity to interview a living legend, someone who shaped American music, and you squandered it. You chose cheap controversy over meaningful conversation. That's what's unbelievable. She walked off the stage as the audience erupted into stunned, confused applause. Andy remained motionless, his face a mixture of shock and humiliation. Turning back to the camera, he forced a strained smile. We're going to take an early break, he said. As the broadcast cut to black, one thing was undeniable. Dionne Warwick had just reminded everyone watching what dignity looked like. What standing up for oneself and refusing to compromise one's values looked like. She had walked onto that stage as a legend. And she walked off proving exactly why that title was deserved, not just because of her music, but because of her unwavering demand for respect after a lifetime of earning it.